Hi everyone, thanks for coming to Hack MIT's beginner workshop. I'm Alan, I'm one of the people here at Hack MIT that does a lot of dev things. Outside of Hack, I am a junior at MIT studying computer science and math. Co-teaching this workshop will be Amanda.
Yeah, hi, I'm Amanda, I'm a sophomore. I'm also on the dev team for Hack, and I'm studying 6-9.
Can people in the back hear me when I speak at this volume? Awesome. All right, so without further ado, today we're going to be presenting a beginner workshop. So today's workshop will be like a general overview of a lot of tech and tools that we use here at Hack MIT. So hopefully by the end of this workshop, you'll have a general idea of how to make a website. This workshop is not intended to be super comprehensive in any way. To really know the ins and outs of web development, you really have to spend a lot more time than this 1.5 hour period. So this is more of a opportunity to give you just a sampling of the different tools that we use here at Hack MIT. But before we jump into anything, who here brought their laptop, out of curiosity? Awesome. All right, so feel free to follow along. So all the code that will be presented today is on the GitHub. So you can find that at go.hackmit.org/workshop-code. If you want the cheat sheet, which will be referred to later on, you can go to go.hackmit.org/GitHub cheat sheet. And finally, to have access to these slides, you can go to go.hackmit.org/workshop. That's where you can find our resources. So today, as I said, we're going to be covering a variety of tools that we use at Hack MIT. Specifically, the first part of the workshop, we'll be talking about how to use the command line, also how to use GitHub. The second part of the workshop, we'll be covering basic HTML, CSS. The third part will be JavaScript. And the final part of the workshop will be covering how do you integrate all this together and how do you host it using a Flask backend. So, setup. So something that's very important in coding is collaboration. As you know, most things that are done in the tech world are not done alone. They're usually done with a large team. You work with a lot of brilliant, smart people out there. So there are definitely a lot of tools for collaboration. Google Docs, USB Drive, Microsoft Word, but the one that people use to code is GitHub, because GitHub allows for all these great features. So, what is version control and what is Git? So, version control is a tool that helps you track and manage changes to your code. It helps you allow multiple people to work on the same code base. It allows you to turn back the clock when mistakes are made, kind of like reverting to a different time in Google Docs history. It allows you to test different features on different versions or branches of your project. And Git, on top of all this, is a version control system that allows you to control basically this history and allow these changes to go through. And GitHub is what manages these online repositories for your code projects using Git. So before we start, who here needs to make a GitHub account? Okay, so we have a couple of brilliant TAs today. Can you please raise your hand if you are a TA? Great. And the people who need to make a GitHub account, raise your hand. So take note, just TAs, feel free to, these are our TAs, feel free to go around. So our TAs will come around and help answer questions and help you out. If you have other questions, you want to flag down TA, just raise your hand and they'll come over and help you out. So first, if you don't have a GitHub account, please make one. And second, we'll be talking a little bit about the CLI. So the command line interface is basically a portal where you can communicate directly to your computer through certain commands. If you have a Windows computer or Linux, for Linux, you can open up a Linux shell. For Windows, you can go into the Windows Store and download an Ubuntu shell. For Mac/Linux users, you can directly open up Terminal. So you can do that on Mac if you just use do command space to open up Spotlight Search and type terminal. in the terminal, you can run certain commands to interact directly with your computer. Here's a short list of the most commonly used ones that we have. For a more complete list, you can go to the cheat sheet at go.hackmedia.org/github-cheat sheet. And to talk about some examples, so how you use the CLI is you type these commands basically into your command line interface. You run the command by typing it and pressing enter. For Windows users, this might take a little bit longer, but go into the store and download the Ubuntu app. So Windows users, this will be the kind of interface that you'll be interacting with. So here we're going to talk a little bit about these common commands. This isn't 100% important for other things that will come later, so don't worry if this doesn't make sense. This is just meant to give a general overview of certain ways that you can interact with the computer. So let's say you're inside a folder, so I'm in a folder called setup. I run a command called make dir, Allen, and what does this do? It creates a new folder inside the setup folder. So the important thing about Git and also CLI is that GitHub can be used directly through the CLI. So as I mentioned, GitHub is a tool that is used to help manage your code, help you push changes or like finalize changes so that other people can see them. It's also used to just generally share your code and manage your versions. But the great thing about GitHub is that you can run all these commands directly inside your command line interface. So in your terminal, you can run Git commands. Inside Ubuntu, you can also run Git commands. So how do you get Git? On a Mac, you can first check if you have Homebrew. If you don't have Homebrew, later you can go definitely install it or download it at brew.sh. After doing that, you can use brew to install Git, directly using brew install Git. And for Windows, you can directly run these two commands here. Again, it's great if you can follow along in this workshop, or if you can't, you can always return and view these slides at a later time and go through them. We're going to be sticking around for the entire weekend at HackMIT, so if you have issues, feel free to call us over or flag down a mentor using our help queue. Next, you can verify the installation is successful on both ends. Finally, you can configure your GitHub username and your GitHub credentials in the command line. So all these commands are run directly in the command line. They're going to be inside the CLI, whether that be terminal or Ubuntu.
Sorry, did you have a question?
I did. If you have GitHub desktop installed, does this process, do we do both of those?
Oh yeah, so if you have GitHub desktop installed, you can directly interact with Git by clicking, like using the UI there.
Okay.
The nice thing about command line is that everything is just in one place when you make folders or when you like run certain commands.
Okay.
But GitHub desktop will work perfectly fine for this.
So GitHub, where you have that, don't do this? Don't
Yeah,
do it?
sure.
Okay. Unless we want, okay, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Great. We're going to talk briefly about some Git principles. These are like general principles of how to use Git. So you can imagine there are definitely some like safeguards and like guardrails that Git has added to make sure that you only push code or like you only share code with all of your coworkers if you're like sure about that code. So as a result, there's an entire pipeline or process for how you finalize code and share it with other people. So the first thing that happens is you would make a change locally on your computer. So you have a file, let's say, hello world, you want to write some lines of code, you write and you save those changes to your computer. So now it's a file that's changed on your local desktop. Next, you have to add files to staging area. This tells Git that these files have been changed and are noteworthy and should be paid attention to. Next, the changes are committed. This means that all the files that have been changed in the staging area are now basically packaged, all those edits are packaged together and basically sent off and record it as like a change in history. You can imagine on, for example, on Google Docs, when you see version history, there are certain changes in time. There's certain blocks in time. You can see those as sort of like Git commits. For instance, you may have changed like several edits in many files. It doesn't make sense to have each of those edits be like snapshot history. It's better to have all those edits together as like a single snapshot or a single checkpoint in history. Finally, after you commit your code, you can push it. And what this means is that your code, after you commit it locally, you push everything onto github.com. And this way, everyone who you're working with can now view these changes online live. So this is an example of this happening on Ubuntu. You can ignore the git branch command, but you can see that at some point you cd into git setup, so we're going to a folder called git setup. We run git status, so that's a command that helps just view which files have been committed, which files have been added, etc. There is a file that has been changed. For example, here you can see jamieflu.txt is a new file that has been changed, committed. We then commit with a message. This basically is a message that's associated with this change. And then this is finally pushed onto github.com. So all these commands, again, can be found on go.hackingd.org/GitHub cheat sheet. If you ever need help using GitHub, you can always search online and find many resources on how to use Git. Are there any questions on GitHub, CLI, any general principles? Great. Again, remember, so that was like a general overview of how to use Git in the CLI. So it wasn't that big of a deal. You didn't grasp every single detail. It's just good to grasp the general principles of how to use them, why we have a CLI, and why we have GitHub. Without further ado, I'll pass it over to Amanda.
Yeah, okay. So now I'm going to go over HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, which are basically the essentials of building a website. And to do that, we're actually going to walk through creating a game. And again, like the code, if you can't follow along completely, or you miss copying down something that I might mention, all the code is at go.hackingit.org/workshop code. So in case you miss anything, you can always follow along there. Okay. So what we're actually going to be building today is a very simple math game. So it's going to be an addition game, and basically the job is to state if the math problem is correct or not. So you can see that on the top, 28 plus 3 equals 31, that's a correct one. So in order to go on to the next part of the game, or basically to score, you would hit the check button to say that it's correct. And on the bottom is an example where it's an incorrect problem that it's stating. So in order to score another point, you would hit the X. So that's the goal of the game, is to register these correct or wrong answers. And so there are going to be two difficulties. We're going to be building an easy mode and a hard mode, which will basically change how big the numbers are. And then we're also going to keep the score. So as you can see in these screenshots, that we're keeping score at the bottom. And so in order to do this, we're going to have 3 pages, which is the index.html, which is basically like the welcome page. Then we're also going to have a game page for the actual game. And then we're going to have a game over screen. Okay, so how do we actually build this game? We're going to start with HTML, once the slides like me. Or if they go. If you have to be patient. Okay, so what is HTML? HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language, which is basically really big words to say that it is the essential structure of a website. It is the bare bones and the skeleton of what you're making, and if you don't have HTML, you won't have anything to use CSS or JavaScript with. It tells us how to display, basically it tells us what to display on a website, so any content that you put, that's all in HTML. And in order to make a file, you have anything, or you name it anything, and .html will follow it, and then you'll have your HTML file to begin. HTML. What is HTML? What goes into it? We have HTML elements. So as you can see in the screenshot, we have basically the barest bones of what HTML might be. So each element starts with a tag, which is started with a left arrow, and then some text, and then followed by a right arrow. And any content will go inside after that. And then to end the content, to say that we want to end whatever space we're talking about, we end it with a left arrow slash the same name, and then a right arrow. So as you can see, we have some tags like HTML and then slash HTML at the very end. So anything that's inside of that will all be contained within the HTML tags. And so there are some basic things. So at the very top, you can see doc type HTML, which basically tells the whatever thing that we're working with that that entire document is going to be HTML. And then we have the HTML tag, which basically is where everything is going to go in. And we have things like head, which you can see, which is the first thing inside HTML. And it's basically displays it's undisplayed data. So things like we will later put in CSS, JavaScript. You can also put in a website title and icons for your website, etc. And body is basically where everything that will actually be displayed goes. So anything that you actually want to display on your website, like the game, for instance, everything that we're going to be we actually want to see will all go in body. And finally, you can see that we're actually using comments in the green text in that screenshot. So you can indicate a comment by using a left arrow and then exclamation point and 2 dashes, and then ending it with 2 dashes and a right arrow. And so you can see that we indicated meta information, or information that isn't displayed in the head, and website content in the body in that screenshot. Okay, so what actually goes in head? You can see that there's a title tag, so title, and inside the title tag is my website, so that's going to be the name of the website. That's what's displayed on the tab, in Google search, etc. And then we can also make a favicon, or a shortcut icon. So that's what indicates what will be like the little tab icon that you see on browsers. In order to do that, you do link, rel equals shortcut icon. You have the type equal whatever file type that you want for your icon. And in this case, for the link to the actual icon, I have it as assets/logo.png because of how my file structure is currently. And so you can see that if you run this head, then it'll actually change just whatever the default is to actually something that is stylized. So you have the icon that I wanted, and also my website is displayed as the title. Does anyone have questions on that so far? Okay, cool. Okay, so now we're going to talk about what goes in body, which really can be a lot of different things. So one of the most popular things to use is a div, which is a division or section of content. And it's really versatile. You can do a lot of things with it. So some good things to know, or good properties to know about how to use div, is that it can have a class. So for instance, in the screenshot, if you go down a little bit after ready to play, there's a div class equals buttons. And class can apply to multiple divs. And you can have multiple classes for every div, and it can apply to multiple elements. An ID is unique a div can only have one ID, and it's unique to only that div. It shouldn't apply to anything else. And finally, you can have style, which we aren't going to be using in this sense, but it's good to know. It's basically, once we talk about CSS later, you can put inline CSS, which basically means that you can quickly add some styling to a div, and it will only apply to that element. So an example of how this might be applied is here. So you can have multiple classes contained within this class equals parameter, and then you can also have a singular ID name. And some other things that you can do is that you can create a paragraph for text using P as a tag, and you can see that we use it for ready to play up in the screenshot. You can also have links, which is used using A. And in order to use that, you can have a href. A href, which basically will be the link. And then whatever you put inside those A tags will be what is actually displayed as a link. So for instance, if I wanted to link to hackerlit.org, then it might look like something like as past the arrow, which is just link. And then if you actually clicked on that link, it would link to hackerlit.org. Or in the sense of our screenshot, we have an a equals /easy, which we want to later redirect to our website, to the website point /easy. So when you hit that button, easy mode, when you hit easy mode, it'll redirect and link you to that page. And finally, some other good things to know are things like H1, H2 through H6 tags, which are basically built-in headings, which will have different, like it'll be bold and it'll have different size fonts. Okay, so now we're going to talk about what CSS is. CSS is, oh wait, did anyone have any questions about the previous parts, about HTML? Okay, so now we're going to talk about CSS. So CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and it's basically, you can add styles and designs to elements. It basically provides the look, feel, and design of your entire website. Without CSS, it'll just be black and white and like Times New Roman text on a website, and it's not very pretty. So CSS is really where it comes in. And in order to make a CSS file, you can create whatever file name and do .css. And this is an example of what CSS might look like inside our file. I'll later show you an example of what it will look like for us. But in this case, you have something that you want it to apply to. So in this case, it's indicating a key tag or a paragraph tag that we mentioned earlier. And then it'll always use curly braces. And then each line will be a different property and value. So in this case, in this screenshot, we have a property, so in this case font family, and then a value, which in this case is indicating like a different font, which is Verdana. And that will apply to every p tag that exists in the HTML. We'll see more concrete examples in the next slide. Okay. So in order to add CSS to HTML, you have to add it inside the head tag, as I mentioned earlier. In order to do that, you do link rel equals style sheet, and then the hera will link to wherever your file is in your directory. So in this case, for me, it was styles.css because it was existing in the same file directory. If you named your CSS file something different, like index, then it would be index.css, etc. Okay, and back to the CSS structure. So this is again like another bare bones way to look at it. Any property will be property colon and then whatever value you want, and then a semicolon. So in this case, on the right, you can see that everything follows the same structure of a name, curly braces, and then a property colon and a value semicolon. Okay. So you might be looking at things like pass body and A and see class, dot class, and the dot indicates that it's a div class or any class that is being applied to anything in the HTML document. So it's not an actual class tag, it's something with like div class equals the name class. And then ID is something similar, except we use the prefix of a hashtag. So anything with, like say a div ID, quote ID, then that will have that style of tag. And if there's no prefix, then it indicates a tag. So body means that everything inside the body will have, or whatever's contained inside the body will have a certain color, background color. In this case, it's like a very light gray or white. Or for the A tag, anything that's an A tag or a link will be red. Does anyone have any questions about that? Okay, cool. Okay, so going more in depth about this, there are lots of different properties. So things like background color and color, as you can see in the body, you have a background color, and that's using a hex code. Hex codes basically are just different ways to ID code for the purpose of websites and live web design. So I normally use a color picker. I don't have all of these memorized. I don't think anyone does, except for maybe like very basic ones like white and black. Or you can always use built-in colors. So for instance, for the A tag, I set color red, and there are very select colors that you can use that are just words, and they're already built into the CSS. There are other things like width and height. Width and height basically control how big your space is. So if I was making a div and I only wanted it to be like a tiny square, then maybe I would do like 100 pixels. PX stands for pixels. You can use other units, but in this case, pixels is what we're going to be using here. We also have things like border. So for that hashtag ID, we have a border, which takes different values or multiple values. So we have a width, a style. In this case, we're using solid. There are other things like dotted and dashed. And then we also have a color that we'll use. And then there are also things like padding and margin, which are really useful in terms of spacing things out on your website. Padding is used for things that are for containing things inside your box. So if you want things to be like farther away from the border of your box inside, then you'll add more padding. And margin basically spaces things outside of like a div or a box. So if you want it to be farther away from something else, then you'll put a bigger margin. And finally, there are plenty of other things. In this case, I said font size, font family, which you saw earlier, and text transform. Those are all different things. So font size controls how big your text is. Font family will give you a different font, different way to see the text. And text transform can do things like make all of your text uppercase, all of your text lowercase. And there are lots more, way more than this. But these are just some select few things that you can do with CSS. And if you want to learn more, there are plenty of good resources like W3 Schools and CSS Tricks will give you a lot more about what other properties you can use with CSS. And there are also things something called Flexbox, which really helps you space out your design. We won't cover it fully here, but it is used in the code today that we're going to be showing, and it's purely just to have something centered or just have the correct spacing, and it just helps a lot, so you don't have to do it manually. And there are also things like semantic UI or Bootstrap, which are basically they're already pre-made stylings. So if you're not feeling like coding an entire component or like a button all by yourself, and you really just want a simple button that doesn't look like the horrible HTML button that you normally get, you can download styles from Semantic UI or Bootstrap and add it to your website. And that way, you don't have to go through all the hassle of creating a whole new button again and again, or by yourself. And we're actually going to be using Bootstrap, and I'll explain that on the next slide. So just for simplicity, we're going to be using Bootstrap, which is a set of already made stylings you can add. And we're going to add it. This is the link. It'll probably be more helpful to go to this link, and it'll give you a line to put into your CSS. I'm only saying go to this link because the line that they give you to put into the HTML is kind of long, and I would not want you guys to go through the hassle of copying every single character because it is a little much. So for instance, you will probably get something like this. See the red arrow. So this is a line that you'll get, and this single line will give you everything you need for Bootstrap. And in this case, we're only using it basically for buttons. So as I mentioned earlier, I didn't want to code my own buttons myself. So I borrowed the Bootstrap ones just to make it look nice. And in order to get those, you put this line under your head tag with your CSS style. Does anyone have any questions about that? Yeah.
So when we use button tags in our HTML file, so it will look up the buttons from Bootstrap.
Yeah. So I mean, not everything that is styled is going to be borrowed from Bootstrap, but Bootstrap basically gives you they already have pre-made classes, and you can just take those class names and add it into your HTML, and then it'll already be styled by Bootstrap. So we'll see that later with our buttons. We have specific button classes that we borrow from Bootstrap, and it automatically adds them. Does anyone else have any questions? Okay, cool. Or does anyone need time to go to Bootstrap, or should I pause? Okay. Okay, so putting it all together, we have this HTML for our welcome page. So welcome, ready to play, some buttons like easy mode and hard mode. So kind of like what I was talking about earlier. This class BTN, standing for buttons, and BTN primary, which basically gives a color to the button. Those two classes are from Bootstrap. And those two classes, basically, we'll see later. So at this end, so without Bootstrap, those two would just be like gray, like very small, like rectangular buttons. But because we added BTN and BTN primary from Bootstrap, they automatically become blue and are like much easier to read and look a lot nicer. And so in the middle, so we have our extra CSS. So you can see that I used margin and padding, and also some width and height and border. And if you're curious about this bottom, this is all stuff from Flexbox, which I only purely use just to center things inside this box. Otherwise, everything would be like up at the top and to the left, and wouldn't nearly look as nice as it does right now. So yeah, so putting both HTML and CSS, you got the thing on the right. Does anyone have any questions about that? Yeah.
Can you clarify exactly what a class is and how that interacts with the rest of the code?
Yeah, so class basically identifies a certain element. So if I'm adding, let's say I guess the easiest one is so div class equals buttons. So this class defines the space here, like surrounding these two buttons. So basically this space is called buttons. And so when you think about it in terms of the CSS will look through this whole document and try to find this space that's called buttons. So the only thing I do is display flex, which basically puts these two buttons together, like side by side rather than stacked on top. And so the CSS will look through this whole thing. It'll skip whatever, the welcome, we're ready to play, and it'll be like, oh, I found this thing called class, or this thing called buttons. And oh, the CSS told me that hey, I have to display flex these buttons. Or I have to add this property to the buttons. So it goes through that, and then it applies it, and it's like, okay, I found it, and now my job's done. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Okay. Does anyone else have any questions or any clarifications on what I just said? Or anything else? Okay. Okay, so now I'm just going to go through some other things that we have to set up for the game. So this is the actual game. We have a title to say what mode we're in. We have an empty div right now for the prompt, or basically what the math problem will be and where it will be displayed, which we'll go into more later once we have the JavaScript. And then we have the buttons. So we have a right and a wrong button, or a correct and a wrong button. And then you can see that I styled the title, so it can be bigger and it'll be in bold. I also styled the prompt to be way bigger. And I also have the correct and wrong so that way there's a border around the buttons. And so you can see the result here. So we have a bold title, a really big prompt, and then we have some bordered buttons. Does that all make sense? Does anyone have questions about how we got to this point? Okay. So then the final thing that we have to make is a game over screen. So we have the title. So this is actually borrowing from the same CSS. So I'm using the same title and prompt just from the different, this title and prompt can also be used on this game over screen on a different HTML file. So I'm just using those same things. So there's no new CSS that I added. So I just have a game over, score, and then a try again button. That will lead back. So it has an // which will lead back to the beginning, which is the welcome page. Okay. Does anyone have any final questions? Otherwise, I will move on to JavaScript. Yeah.
So whatever you ID, and put as that phrase, that can be used for multiple items that use the same style?
So ID is maybe I didn't do the best practice on these pages, but normally when you should only have one ID per page, because otherwise it gets confusing for things we'll use it later for JavaScript, and ID will make sure that we're only looking for this very one specific thing. And if you have multiple ones, it'll confuse the computer and be wait, there's these multiple things, or maybe you won't find the right thing that you're looking for. In this case, it's okay because we're using it on a separate HTML page. If we had multiple IDs on the same HTML page, say I had 2 ID prompts on this over.html, that would be a little problematic, and maybe we would want to rename or think about making it a class instead of an ID. Does that make sense? Okay. Does anyone else have any questions? Okay, let's talk about JavaScript. So JavaScript adds functionality and interaction with your site. So it will basically turn your site from being static to dynamic. So some examples is that you can make games, which are very interactive, like using your keyboard or your mouse to play a game. You can also animate things to move across your screen or fade in and out. And other things are like some simple things that you might see on other websites are like pop-up boxes or like alerts. Those are typically from JavaScript. And also tabs. Just to switch a tab. It might seem really simple, but just even clicking to switch a tab is most likely JavaScript. So an example is from Hack MIT did a puzzle. And if you don't know what that is, it's basically like a coding challenge. And for one of the coding challenges, I had to make a game to lead into the puzzle. So in this case, it was built purely out of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And so the JavaScript you can see here is that the user has to interact with the keyboard in order to move this person around the screen. And that's all from JavaScript, to listen for when the user will hit a key, and then also subsequently move that character in order, in harmony, I guess, with where the user wanted to go. Okay, so how do we actually add JavaScript? So to add JavaScript to HTML, we're in this case going to add it under /body and right before the /HTML tag, so almost at the very end. So we have a script type equals text/JavaScript, and source, you put whatever file name. In this case, for me, it was game.js. And then you end it without anything inside with a /script. And so some important things that we should just cover quickly in JavaScript is that there are variables, which are very important with how we're going to have the user interact with the game. So there are different things like const, which indicates a constant, things that don't change, let, which is basically a local variable, and var, which is a global variable, and so things that can be reached with any function that we make, or just throughout the whole JavaScript file. So some examples, var x equals 2, for our const name equals Amanda. This is how we'll use variables. Or in this case, in the screenshot, you can see var max number equals 30, which means that we have now made a variable called max number. We can call it within anywhere in our code, which in this case is important for us because that max number will come into play when we're generating random numbers for this game to create different math problems. Okay, and some important functions to know is get element by ID, which I will cover more in depth in the next slide. But basically, you'll attach it to, it'll basically help you find whatever div inside the HTML. So kind of like, I don't know who I was talking to earlier, but I don't remember specifically what question it was, but this is one way to use IDs to help find things. So so if we're using get element by ID title, then we're looking throughout the whole HTML to find a div title, or div ID equals title. And that will be explained more on the next slide. And just one other function that we will also touch on later is an add event listener, which basically will add an event to wait for. So things like click is an event that we can add to any div or anything in the HTML, and then it will wait for that user to click it, and then it will perform some function. Okay, so using get element by ID, so we have a document which is referring to the entire HTML file we're using. So in this case, it's game.html. So all the way up at the top, document.getElementByID title searches the entire game.html for a div ID equals title. And then we have this .inner HTML. And inner HTML basically grabs whatever is in, or is referring to whatever is inside the div. So it's basically, so we had, so you can see here in the screenshot, div ID equals title has inside it hard mode. which is the inner HTML. But so we are using that to read if we should make the max number bigger or not, because that'll make the game harder or not. So if it's on hard mode, then we notice that the max number is higher to actually make the game more difficult in our JavaScript. Oh, does anyone have any questions on that? How we're using get element by ID, document, inner HTML? Okay. Okay, so some other things that we are doing in JavaScript. Oh, I should mention that I don't know if people are following along, but this the code at the very top is the beginning of our game.js. So the first thing that we're doing is basically looking for, we're basically setting the max number first, because that will affect everything else that we're doing. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do is create a custom function. And custom functions are just lead with function. I don't know how many people are familiar with Java or Python, but if you're familiar with Python, then you know that you define a function with def. This is a similar thing, but in JavaScript you use function. And then you have the name of your function and a parameter inside. And if you're familiar with Python, then you know that you normally do a colon and then you indent. But in this case, for JavaScript, you use curly braces. So in this case, we need to get a random integer in order to generate these random numbers that we're using for these math problems. So in this case, we are doing a return math.floor, which is basically make an integer, and then we get a random number, and then the max parameter, which is in this case for us like the 300, or whatever we set based on the difficulty, and then it'll basically get any number between that and the max number. Okay. So then, actually creating a math problem, we're going to make a new function called getNewProblem. And we're going to start by declaring variables for what we're modifying. So in this case, we have correct, wrong, and prompt. And these all are grabbing different div IDs from the HTML. So we had a correct and wrong button, so that's what we're referring to for our correct and wrong variables. And then prompt refers to that empty div ID equals prompt earlier. That's where we're going to insert all of our math problems into later. Okay, and then we need to generate random numbers. So we have these two new variables, num1 and num2, which both use the function up at the top to get two random numbers. And then we also have this const adjust, which is something that won't change. And it's a list or array of three different numbers, which will basically add -1, 0, or 1 to our final solution, just to make it vary, and so we actually have an incorrect answer, so it can bounce back and forth between answering correct or incorrect solutions. And then finally, creating and displaying the solution. So the display solution adds the two numbers and then also adjusts it to make it random and whether it's actually a correct or incorrect prompt, and then we will put that whole thing inside the prompt. So prompt.innerHTML, we're setting whatever's inside that prompt now to say to the num1 plus num2 equals whatever solution that we created. So if it was 2 plus 3 equals 5, then innerHTML 2 plus 3 equals 5 will be displayed. Does anyone have any questions on that? Does anyone have any questions on how I'm inserting numbers inside the .innerHTML? Or is it clear? Okay. So now we're going on to the next step. So now we actually need to decide how people will continue on in the game or go to the game over. So if they answer correctly, we need to create a new problem and add to their score. And if they answer incorrectly, then we need to redirect them to the game over page. So in this case, we have a correct answer function. So these two functions will exist outside of the function we were working on. But we have getNewProblem, which calls that function again, which basically to create a new problem. Then we add to the score, and then we will display the score, the new score to the user. So in this sense, we have a score div, and we're going to change whatever's inside that score div to whatever their new score is. Otherwise, if you don't have that line, then you're updating the score, but the user will never know whatever their updated score is. They will just constantly see 0 if you don't update it like that. And then finally, we have a function gameOver, which is basically window.location.replace. Will redirect the user to wherever you want, and in this case, we're doing /over, which is another page, and /over / whatever our score is, which we'll talk about more later when we get to Flask. Because we'll use how we send the score over in the URL in Flask. And then now we need to actually determine which button matches the right solution. If you remember, we had that check and the X. And we actually need to make sure that those have functionality. So depending on what we generated with that display solution and how we adjusted it, if the prompt is actually correct, so if it was like 2 + 3 = 5, then if the user says, yes, that's a correct statement, then that means that they did a correct answer, and so it'll give them a new score, new problem. Otherwise, if they hit that no, 2 + 3 = 5 is not a right statement, then that's game over. So in that case, we're using add event listener. And with click, so it's waiting for the user to click either button. And then it'll, depending on if they click it, then it'll assign them that function. So in this case, we're assigning the correct button, the correct answer function, and the wrong button, the game over function. But we swap these if the prompt isn't correct. So if it was like 4 + 5 is supposed to equal 9, but if instead it displayed 4 + 5 = 10, then that means that the prompt isn't correct. So if the user says, no, that's not correct, then they are right, that it's not a correct statement. So then if they hit that, then that will be the correct answer. And if they say that it's correct, then that's also game over for them. Does anyone have any questions on how all of that works? Add event listener, clicking, the logic? Okay. So the final thing we need to do is actually we need to add these set of statements, which is removing all of the listeners that we just added if we're generating a new problem. This is because if you don't do this, then those buttons will keep those functions. And so if it changes, so like saying it's a correct answer, and then the new prompt is that's actually a wrong answer, but they still hit like wrong. If they answer correctly and say, yes, that's a wrong answer, it'll still direct them to a game over because we haven't cleared those functions. So if we don't clear those functions, then the functionality of the game is kind of broken. So we need to basically create a clean slate by removing all of these event listeners and starting anew. So we're going to add these set of statements towards the beginning of our function. So you can see that I added these remove event listeners basically almost at the very top of the function. And then the final thing that you have to do is call the function outside of all of these functions. You just add it at the very, very top of the game.js, which is get new problem just to start it. And so that way, when you start the page, it'll actually start with just like your first problem. Otherwise, if you click on it, then you're just never gonna get a problem until you hit a correct or wrong answer, which wouldn't be very good for the game. Does anyone have questions on this? Removing that listener? Yeah.
So I assume JavaScript is different from a lot of languages in that you can call a function before you define it.
Yeah. Yeah, you can do that. I think, yeah, basically, even if you call it at the very top, it'll look through. You can it'll go down to the bottom and be like, oh, there it is, and then call it. Yeah.
Because Python doesn't.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions on that? Okay, and then I will pass it off back to Alan to talk about Flask in terms of code.
Thank you, Amanda. I guess before we even talk about Flask, I just want to jump into github.com, kind of show everyone where the code lives. So if I can go to go.fmt.org / workshop-code. We have a couple of branches here, so these are just different versions of the code base. one of the versions is, so what Amanda covered is all inside HTML template. So this is where all of Amanda's files were. So if you ever want to try out this game on your own, you can either clone this by using git clone in the command line, or you can just download the code here directly. So you can also view these by clicking on any individual files. So for example, if you hit index.html, you can see that code is here. You can copy and paste it onto your own computer if you'd like to try it out. So yeah, these are the files that Amanda was dealing with. So regarding Flask, so for the Flask portion, we're going to start with the Flask template. And this is basically a general template for any app that begins with Flask. So if over this weekend you're interested in, for instance, making a web server on Flask, feel free to use this template to start. So Flask is basically what will host the website, and then HTML, CSS, JavaScript is like what the pages on the website are made of. And so to get the final product, you basically have to take what Amanda worked on in the HTML template and the Flask template, kind of merge it together. And that final product is inside main. So if you want to see the final product, feel free to just download the code at main. Alright. So we're going to jump Flask and talk a little bit about Flask. Alright, so hosting with Flask. So first of all, what is Flask? Flask is a Python code framework that helps you host websites and create a backend. This basically means there's a lot of HTML pages that you have, loosely speaking, and you want Flask to kind of direct certain routes like /game, /home, /index to each of these pages. Flask can also help work with the database, and also backend, but those things won't be covered today. But if you ever want to save data somewhere, so like when you refresh the page, your game doesn't reset, it's like saved somewhere, or if you have user accounts or authentication, Flask is a good way to go about things. Even though we're not covering it today, you can search it up. You can search it up online. There'll be a lot of tutorials to help cover this content. So first, to run Flask, because Flask is a Python framework, you need to make sure you have Python and pip. So you can go download Python on this website, and pip can also be downloaded here. So the directions are written on the slide. I can leave it to you to figure out in your own time. So to view the Flask code, as I mentioned, you can go clone the Flask template by doing it directly in the command line, or you can go to the website on github.com, or it's the same one here, go to hackaday.org/Photoshop-code, where you can download the zip for the code directly. There are a lot of files there in the Flask template, but only a couple of them are relevant, and we're going to be discussing some of them today, so you can see which parts kind of create this web hosting thing together. So first of all, at the very root of the Flask template, you can see run.py. And to run your project, actually, at the very end, you just need to do python 3 run.py, python run.py. And what this does is it basically takes, it runs the blurb in the last 2 lines. It will try to find a port that you set. If there's no port set, it will default to port 5000. This is just what port to run on your computer. And then it will do app.run on that port with debug mode to be true. And app, as you see above in the middle of the code, app is created using create app. And so what create app does is it creates a general Flask app. This is done elsewhere inside the app folder that we'll talk about next, but app is essentially a Flask app, and this Flask app is run using the .run function here. So where app is initialized is inside init.py. So in init.py in the app directory, we have a create app function that you saw on the previous slide. Here, what we do is we initialize app to be a Flask app. So you can see we import the Flask. Now we're creating an app. The middle blurb here loads a bunch of config variables from config.py. This is in case you want to add some secrets inside your app at some point if you're building something that's more complex. Some of the examples of this is like the database URI, or let's say you have an admin account here, or if you have like a secret cheat code that will allow users to fast pass to a different level. Where those can be stored is inside config.py. It's important you don't put those directly in HTML, because everything in HTML people can see online, so people will be able to find that out. what's happening at the very bottom here, here we're registering what's called blueprints. And what that means is we're basically registering a couple of routes. So how Flask does routing is it groups a bunch of HTML files together into like a lump. You can imagine on some websites such as Facebook, you have like login page and there's like a lot of different pages there, but they're all under like the login category. And similarly, like there's Messenger, but it's also under Facebook.com technically. So what Blueprints does is basically groups together your HTML files into like categories and basically a collection of routes. But because our game is simple today, we're just going to have basically one bucket, and that's going to be like the game route. So this is looking a little bit more in detail for the game route. This is just the Flask template, so there's actually no HTML files here right now. But at the top, we create a blueprint object, which basically means we're going to group all of these paths here under like this common name game. These decorators here, symbolized with the at symbol, kind of denote where you can find these pages. So if you go to slash, you'll just see a home page. If you go to slash easy, you'll see the text easy. If you go to slash hard, you'll see the word hard. If you go to slash over, you'll see the words game over. I guess another thing that I should mention is methods here. It's not very important right now, but this is a get method, which means that when you go to slash over, you get something on your page on your computer. You'll see the word game over. Another thing to mention is up there on the blueprint, we see URL prefix. So if you ever want to like make another blueprint and group it under like another category, let's say slash game 2, for instance, then instead of going to slash easy /hard /over, you would go to slash game 2 slash game 2 easy slash game 2 hard and slash game 2 over. So that's why Blueprints kind of provides a nice way to group together your routes and your pages in HTML. Okay, yeah, so this is the general structure of the app under the branch Flask template. This is basically all that here. License readme requirements aren't very important. Ignore an M aren't important either. Run.py was that first file that I showed, which was the entry point. And you would run the program by doing Python 3 run.py. If you remember correctly, run.py had a create app function that was imported from app. And that was defined inside init.py. Init.py would initialize the app and kind of register the blueprint route. The blueprint route is located in views.py in the game. And that basically creates all the different routes. And they're all like grouped together into game views.py. And that's kind of imported into init.py. And then init.py is run using, or init.py is called run.py. And then that kind of creates your entire app. There's some other files here, as you can see in the static folder. There's CSS.js, and then there's templates index.html. So those are there right now just as placeholders, but we'll replace them shortly with the files that Amanda introduced in the previous parts of the tutorial. Okay, so to create a new app, we simply just need to replace everything with what Amanda did. So it's a JS, we would have game.js, CSS, Amanda's style of CSS. Amanda also used assets, logo.png, so she had an image for like the logo of the website. And then under templates, we have game.html, index.html, and over.html. These are the three files that Amanda introduced earlier in the talk. Are there any questions at this point about Flask in general? Great. So if you recall, previously, we just had return text, a certain text or a certain string in each of these routes. But now, instead of returning just a string, well, we want to actually return the HTML page inside each of these routes. To do that, we use the render template method from Flask. And this basically, what Flask will do when it sees render template, it will automatically detect the template folder that was seen on the previous slide. And it will go look for the HTML file inside this template folder. So for home page, it would look for index.html, for easy and hard, it would look for game.html, and for over, it would look for over.html. Now you might ask, what is this like second part here, score was score or mode was hard? Those are parameters that we pass directly into Flask templates. So the nice thing about Flask is that when you have an HTML page, you might want to replace some things with other details that are more customizable. For instance, if you have a user login, you might want to replace like welcome with welcome the username. And that data, it can't be really hard-coded into an HTML file because if you have 10 people playing the game, you would need to create 10 different HTML files for those 10 different people. How Flask handles this is it kind of generalizes it by adding like a parameter. So instead of welcome Amanda, you would see welcome name, and it would pass name into the parameter. In this case, if you recall, inside game.html, there was easy mode or hard mode. And so we kind of refactored the HTML file to have mode followed by mode. And this way, it will get replaced as hard mode or easy mode when we render it in Flask. Oh, and I guess one other point I should mention. So over here, you can see score is passed in as a parameter. But something special about score. This score is actually passed in directly through the URL route. So when you go to /over/7, for instance, this 7 will get passed into this function and into the HTML template. So that's another way how Flask can receive parameters directly from the user or through the URL. So here you can just see some changes that Amanda and I made when we were kind of merging these two parts of the code together, HTML and also the Flask part. So here you can see originally the code said hard mode, but we just changed it to mode. This way when we pass mode which is easy, it gets replaced, and mode which is hard gets replaced with easy mode or hard mode. Another thing that's important to mention is that routing is a little different in Flask. This is because originally in Amanda's code base, all the files were in the same folder. But now, as you saw earlier, there's a static folder and there's a templates folder. Now we can't really reference it because the computer doesn't know where things are. But luckily for us, Flask actually has a convenient way to kind of introduce routing. So you would use, instead of just game.js, you would do URL for static file js game.js. What this does is it will tell Flask to look for the static folder inside the project, and then go find js/game.js, which is the game.js file in the JS folder. And a similar thing happens with the icon. So instead of just logo.png, we now have URL for a static folder. File name is assets logo.png. Very similar thing happens here for index.html. We're just replacing a route issue, and also, I guess we're fixing 2 route issues. Finally, for the over page, if you recall, there's a score parameter. So now we're doing a very similar thing here. We just have score equals score. I didn't mention this earlier, but the 2 curly braces kind of make it a parameter inside Flask. And then we're again replacing routing here and routing up there as well. But after you do that, you're basically done. If you do Python 3 run.py, you should be able to see each of these pages come up. When you go to /index.html, or you go to /easy/hard, you go to the easy and hard mode, and we go to /over/7 or /6, you see game over, it's 6. So after that, everything will be basically there, and you will have everything available on localhost 5000 on your computer. So in total, that's how you would go ahead and create a Flask app to serve HTML templates with CSS styling and dynamic behavior in JS. Any final questions?
It can also be general things that maybe something that maybe we didn't cover, but if you have questions about like how else to use Flask or anything that we covered in Git or HTML, CSS, JavaScript. I think maybe things that like you have questions on just yourself, like maybe if you tried it out before, you can also put questions on that.
Yeah, I guess any questions about if you're interested in exploring this further or getting a more detailed introduction, definitely give pointers to resources. Just anything in general. Yeah.
On which side are the computations done for the game?
I'm sorry?
On which side are the computations done for the game? The front end on the backend, but it's not really a backend over it since it's a local server. But if, for example, you put it on a server, which side would do the computation?
Oh, we're starting with the computation. So right now, the front end does the computation. So people who didn't hear, I'm sorry, what's your name?
Abdullah.
Abdul?
Yeah.
For people who didn't hear Abdul's question, Abdul is asking whether the computation, which is like checking whether answers are right or wrong, if that's happening inside the front end, which is HTML, CSS, JavaScript, or if it's happening in the back end, Flask. It didn't really happen anywhere in the back end. The game was fully functional, the front end by itself, and so the checking and computation is done in the front end. The back end is just to serve basically the routes, and the reason why we demoed that here is because we just want to give a brief intro to Flask routes before diving too deep into like APIs and backend stuff. Good question. Any other questions? All right, looks like that's all. For more information, check out these links. Definitely save these. The video will be uploaded online, whether it's public or private is to be determined.